Mahmoud, I'm here. Can you see me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, wonderful. I was talking. Oh, I was muted. I'm sorry. So I'll repeat. So welcome everyone. Today we have our topic is the Ukrainian crisis, the effects of the Ukrainian crisis on international relations, which means, or with other phrase, how will be the shape of the world after this crisis and after this conflict. The main speakers are highly experienced today. We have Mr. James Bacchus, we have Mr. Richard Anderson, and Mr. Ambassador Tomasz Lukaszuk. And today we will treat 4 main points: the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on the international economy and international development. And who will talk to us about that is Mr. James Bacchus, who is Professor of Global Affairs and Director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the University of Central Florida. He is also was founding judge and was twice the chairman of the highest court of the World Trade, the Appellate Court, the Appellate Body of the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and also he was a member of U.S. Congress twice. Then Mr. Richard Anderson, who was a CIA officer and Department of Analysis, and he treated cases of Soviet Union American relationships or American Soviet Union relationships during 70s and 80s, and actually Professor Emeritus and Research Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Mr. Tomasz Lukaszuk will talk to us about the shape of East-West relations after the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Mr. Ambassador Tomasz Lukaszuk is a scholar at the Department of Regional and Global Studies at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw in Poland. And he worked as Polish Foreign Service in the Polish diplomacy for 25 years until 2017, served in Norway, Indonesia, Singapore, East Timor, India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Maldives. Finally, and the last point or last X, I will talk about, that Mahmoud will talk about, Mahmoud Refaat. It's the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on international security. And I'm the president of the European Institute for International Law. So from here we start. We start with Mr. Bacchus. Dr. Bacchus, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud, Professors Anderson and Lukaszuk. I'm very happy to be here with you. I told Mahmoud I would learn a lot from listening to the two of you today, and I'm sure I will. Mahmoud has asked me to talk about some of what's happening economically as a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just a few minutes ago, here in the United States, President Biden announced that he is going to be halting all oil imports from the Russian Federation. This is something he has been pressed to do increasingly by growing bipartisan majorities of both the House and the Senate. And the fact that he's willing to do that is a sign of just how strongly the sentiment is in the United States for imposing economic pain on Putin and his government, because gas prices are already at highs we haven't seen in the United States for many years, and this will only make them higher. Russia ships us only 7% of our oil supply, but as we've learned once again in this episode in human history, all things are connected, and the global oil market is one. So there will be enormous repercussions throughout the world at a time when oil prices are already skyrocketing. The last I saw, we were talking about $130 a barrel or thereabouts. This is just one instance of what I see as what could be a real change in the global economy, a turning point from a time when economic cooperation was usually possible to a time when I think we're likely to see more and more economic conflict. I'm in favor of imposing all the economic pain on Putin and his cronies that we can. And indeed, I've written articles in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere in the past week or so explaining that I think Putin and his government should be expelled from the World Trade Organization. But at the same time, I think we need to take a bit of a longer look. We need to be mindful of the human consequences of these economic sanctions for real people in Russia who had nothing whatsoever to do with Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. And I think we need to be looking ahead to a way in which the proliferating use of economic sanctions can somehow be disciplined and proportionate, and not lead, as we've seen sometimes in the past, toward outright economic autarky and global protectionism. This concerns me, even as someone who is cheering on the imposition by the United States and its NATO allies and some others of these sanctions on Russia. In terms of what we're seeing already from the economic fallout, we can see that the consequences will not be limited to Russia or to the Ukraine. For example, Egypt depends on, for much of its grain, on imports from Russia. The prices of bread are very high already in Egypt, and they're likely to go much higher. Likewise, there's a reason why Ukraine has long been called the breadbasket of Europe. Its grain is shipped worldwide, but especially to some countries in the Middle East and in Northern Africa that are already facing hunger and higher food prices in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've already mentioned oil. There is also natural gas. I do believe that I saw that Putin, in retaliation, has ceased his exports of natural gas to Europe. As we know, the European Union depends for more than half of its energy on imports of oil and gas from the Russian Federation. It was therefore an act of courage for the German government and also of its fortitude in reversing policy last week and shutting down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Made a huge statement of the determination of not only Germany, but other European countries who are members of NATO to stand up against Putin's military aggression in Ukraine. Of course, we're already dealing with a world that has been massively disrupted by the pandemic economically. We've learned that there are some potential downsides to attenuated supply chains. We've learned a lot about where some of the ingredients in our high technology products come from. Here, for example, we've learned that the Boeing company depends on imports of titanium from Russia in order to be able to put its landing gear together on its large aircraft. And they're making some changes now that would reduce that dependency, although the Boeing company is continuing to maintain its relationship with its Russian partner, a company that's owned by a close colleague, Putin's. Interestingly, we've seen that even where there have not been sanctions, individual businesses, especially large corporations in many sectors, have simply stopped doing business with Russia and Russian companies. This is one more example of how uncertainty many times drives business decisions. Businesses want no more than certainty. They want to know that the contract will be fulfilled. They want to know that the rules won't be changed. They want to know that the products will be delivered. They want to know that the price won't go up beyond what they've contracted for, and so on. And all of these matters and others have been rendered uncertain by these circumstances. So we're likely to see a great deal of economic turmoil in the next few weeks, probably the next few months. An unknown is just how much the Russian economy can suffer in terms of contraction before it might make any difference, if any, in Putin's military decision-making. The latest projections that I've seen show a prediction that the Russian economy will contract by 10% this year. Of course, we have to consider what's happening in Ukraine as well, the victim here. It's unclear whether the farmers of Ukraine are going to be able to plant their spring crop. If they're not, and even if they do, if they're unable to reap it because of the war in their country, then that will have an even greater impact on world grain prices at the worst possible time coming out of, we hope, of this pandemic. I don't think we have yet seen all the repercussions we will see economically from these events. Mahmoud, I'm going to stop there so as not to dominate the time. As I said at the outset, I'm eager to hear from these other two gentlemen, and I'll be happy to answer questions later if anyone has them. Thank you so much for inviting me. Mahmoud, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, James. Well, personally, I'll have some questions and some suggestions as well with you about the future of the international economic relations and how we can improve it and make the world to avoid more suffering, because maybe in the developed countries in Europe and the United States, we will not be impacted a lot on the level of nutrition, for example, but we are started to suffer here in Europe, by the way, by dramatic increase of prices of fuel, of food. Everything started last 3-4 days, we started to feel the result. So I will have personally questions, but we will let the questions until the end. But thank you very much again, James. Well, now, Professor Richard Anderson, you can go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Well, let me echo Professor Bacchus's sentiments about what an opportunity this is to learn from my fellow members of this panel. And I've just learned a lot about the economic situation that, of course, I've given some thought to, but with a lot of new depth. I mostly want to talk about peace and security, which is more the area of my own experience. I was not only a military analyst for the CIA, but an analyst of military intelligence, but then I was a staff member of the House Intelligence Committee, working mostly on analytical issues at the CIA. And finally, both in that capacity, a staffer and later in his private office, a staffer to Congressman Les Aspin. So I kind of know the Hill side of this a little bit too.
A good friend of mine and a great member of Congress.
Thank you. Yeah. No, he was a real public servant, and I benefited from the opportunity to work for him and with him. Learned a lot about politics, but ultimately, I belong in the academic world where I've been since then. Anyway, from that background, one of the things that this event has shown is that the notion of rules-based order in international relations was always something of a fiction. Right. If you know, one of the claims that's been made about keeping the peace in Europe for the last 75 years now, 77 years, was that it was accomplished by the European Union and its predecessor, the Common Market. And you know, if you look at that, the danger to peace in the 20th century in Europe was always Prussia. And the consequence, the eastern part of Germany, the consequence of the 2 world wars was to transfer that territory, most of it to Poland, and to place the rest under Soviet occupation. And so the threat from Germany was never from Bavaria, the Rhineland, Westphalia, Hamburg, the whole sort of commercial, the Ruhrgebiet, the Ruhr Valley. The whole sort of commercial area of Germany, which ended up in West Germany. And so the relations of West Germany with France were never hostile. It was the eastern portion of Germany which took over West Germany and used those resources. That was the threat to European peace. And World War II broke that up. Now, the other thing that preserved the peace, that Russia was replaced by the Soviet Union. One thing that preserved the peace was that although the Soviet Union maintained very large military forces in East Germany, about 300,000 men. So this claim that this is the largest military deployment since World War II is just not true. It's substantially smaller, although big enough. And what maintained the peace in Europe, in my opinion, was the stationing of 300,000 US troops in Germany on a permanent basis, and the US nuclear guarantee. And unfortunately, that military presence in Europe has been allowed to lapse. Now, you know, this is coming from me. I was always to the left of Congressman Aspen. I went to work for him because he was a left expert on defense policy. And, you know, the CIA actually is fairly moderate, but I, you know, it's way too right-wing for me. And I moved further left. I mean, I'm a supporter of people like Ilhan Omar. But, you know, in this crisis, the only option is to restore American military strength. We had 17 maneuver battalions all through the Cold War, permanently stationed in Europe, and pre-positioned equipment for 12 more. It's 29, I said maneuver battalion, pardon me, I always get this backwards. It's 17 maneuver brigades. A brigade is 2 to 5 battalions. The Russians, part of the Russian military problem is that they can only operate at the battalion level. They don't have integrated combat brigades the way the US Army does. So these small organizations, they have a lot of them. They have about 100 stationed in or near Ukraine now. But even so, that's only about 25 battalions, about the same combat force that the United States could deploy in Western Europe, and whose presence and potential deployment kept the peace. Now we're down to 2 permanent ones. One basically quite imperfectly manned, so-called striker battalion named after, striker brigade, there I go again, named after the combat vehicle that it's equipped with, which is not a very satisfactory central warfare combat vehicle. We've got to find a new and better one. And we have a paratroop brigade in southern Italy, and that's it. Now, rotationally, we deploy a 3rd, usually heavy brigade with armor or with infantry fighting vehicles on a rotational basis, usually to Poland. That brigade was deployed again recently when he upped the forces, but that's 3 brigades instead of 29. If we'd had 17 brigades, or even so, the later US presence of about 12 permanent brigades, say 8 in Poland, 4 in Romania, if we'd had that at the beginning of this crisis, Putin would have never crossed the border. And unfortunately, now that's what we do again. Another of the things which I think is a serious error, I was writing about how before this, during the crisis, before the invasion, I was writing about how Putin wasn't going to do it, right? This was an error, clearly. And I know why I made the error. I overlooked one crucial piece of information, which I had, and I decided to discount it. That was wrong. This isn't Putin. Right? One of the things is to blame this very bad man for this crisis. This crisis is related to something fundamental that happened in international politics in 1991. When the Soviet Union broke up, the Soviet Union lost a 1/3 of its territory and half its population. So if you imagine how Americans would react, what Americans would be like if we had lost the whole East Coast and Philadelphia, the cradle of our nation, in the same way that Russians lost what they think is the cradle of their nation, Kyiv, what would the reaction be? Well, it's already true that without that, Joe Biden would have never been elected. Even without that huge loss, Americans would be committed to withdrawal from the world, but actually withdrawal from Europe usually means a more aggressive policy in Asia. And I mean, you know, things like the WTO, like the climate change conference, Trump pulled out of those things anyway, even without this huge loss. Okay, Russians responded to this huge loss. In 1992 in Moscow, I talked to a young woman who was born in Crimea. The Russian word for birthplace and homeland is the same single word, rodina, meaning birth, from the word for birth. And I asked her, what does it feel like to be cut off from your birthplace or homeland? And she answered, it feels like an amputation. If you read even these press interviews, you see that Vladimir Putin's attack has massive public support in Russia. There are a few brave souls who are out there demonstrating, but generally speaking, there's a lot of sympathy with this effort to recover Ukraine. And I don't know how widespread that sympathy is. We don't have any way of knowing. Russians are all so nervous about war. We know that a lot of the troops in Ukraine, at least we think we know a lot of the Russian troops in Ukraine, are unwilling to participate in this thing or reluctant to participate in this thing. Putin met with a group of airline pilots and stewardesses, flight attendants, all female. And he gave a little talk about what they were doing. And then he said, well, should we drink tea or should we have questions? And one of the women says, there are questions. And she says, of course, we fully support what you're doing in Ukraine. We absolutely back everything that you're doing in Ukraine. And then she says, but our women, I mean, so help me, I mean, this is very inappropriate gender language or very unfortunate gender language, but this is what she said. She said, but our womanly hearts are perturbed. And we're worried about, and you know, all this is scripted, right? Nobody should suppose that anything they show on television, as Les Aspin said to me one time, Dick, don't you get it? This is theater, you've got to have a script, right? So everything Putin does is scripted too. And so this question is scripted. But she says, our womanly hearts are perturbed. What about people's children that are going to be injured in this thing? And Putin says, oh, we're taking measures to make sure that none of the draftees are involved in fighting. And we're taking measures to protect the Ukrainian civilians. They keep saying this is false, but he keeps saying that. But that points to the degree to which the Russian population is worried about what's going on there. But the problem is, even though they're worried, Russians generally think what's been done to our country. And they're not going to stop thinking that just because Putin is gone. It's one thing that Professor Bacchus said that I couldn't agree with more. I'm just generally an absolute opponent of the use of sanctions in world politics. But we have to now. And which means that Russians who are going hungry are going to go hungrier, right? And that's a really bad outcome. But unfortunately, it has to be done because in doing this, Putin's relying on coalition, and that coalition isn't going away, which means we do have to try to rebuild military strength. There's the Baltic republics. I mean, you know, the people I mostly talk to in Russia are people who will talk to me. You know, these Russian extremists to whom Putin is trying to appeal by doing this, those people don't want to talk to Americans. Right? So I'm talking mostly to people who are committed to trying to have a European civilization, you know, a civilized democratic order in Russia, which of course has been destroyed. I no longer even go back to Russia because I'm more or less, having been in the CIA, I jeopardize people by having contact with them. You know, in the 90s, I could do it. Now, hopeless. But even then, you know, this personal friend of mine, a guy who was close to, who was a lawyer, international lawyer, and this new openness in Russia, he says to me, Estonia is our Russian territory from the beginning of time. Well, I mean, if that attitude is widespread among the Democrats in Russia, which I think unfortunately it is, then this isn't going away. which means we have to rebuild that 12 maneuver brigade presence in Europe. We have to get the Poles to take it. By the way, I believe the Poles would be overjoyed, but we have somebody who can comment on that. And that's a big problem because the US Army today is not big enough to maintain that kind of presence. And it's not clear that the Army can easily recruit more soldiers than it's got because of the health conditions, mainly obesity, of young Americans of military age. And because in order to maintain a fighting force in that size, you'd have to reindustrialize the United States, which you can't do. I mean, think about the ecological consequences of reopening the US steel industry. There are profound effects here, but if you don't have 12 American maneuver brigades, you can't permanently station and 12 more available to be flown over and marry up on equipment. All that equipment now in the western part of Germany and in the Netherlands has got to be moved to Eastern Poland, and the Poles have to be prepared to take it. And there are all the other problems that arise. I'm going to stop with just this last point. You know, I hope my colleague won't be offended, but there's a lot of concern about the direction that Polish politics is taking and has been taking for a number of years. And, you know, supporting that regime.
Please, Richard, the time. Well,
Yes.
2 minutes. Okay, you still have 2 minutes.
My last point was that one.
Okay. Well, no, you can continue. Finish.
Well, no, I was done, and that was the last thing I raised.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very, very useful, honestly, but, well, I'm more for calming the situation now. However, I have a question for you, but that will be at the end as well. Now we will move to Mr. Ambassador Lucas. To talk to us about how will be the shape of the East-West relations after Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So go ahead, please, Thomas.
Again. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for invitation. I'm really flattered to be in such a company, and I would say from the very beginning that we are on the forefront of the eastern flank of NATO, and we have to remember it. Just 3 hours ago, I extended accommodation to the 2 families of Ukrainians in my country house, and I presume that they will stay there longer than 1 or 2 weeks. And many of my colleagues did the same. We will not have tents and refugee camps. We open our homes, our houses, and community centers for all Ukrainians running away from the war. Second thing is that right, we have security system in Europe. We thought that it's a solid system being built also with the support of the United States since 1970s. And the OSCE, the Council of Europe, European Union, NATO, all those are the same main pillars of the security system in Europe. And that, let's say, from our perspective, solid security system collapsed in the second decade of the 21st century. And I would say that all the old ghosts, not only from the Cold War, but pre-Second World War, they are now alive. We built the security system in Europe starting from the 70s, just to prevent the wars like this one going on in Ukraine. If you take a look at, let's say, the history of Europe, if we are, let's say, we start to dig, let's say, that old boundaries and the delimitation of borders in Europe and the old glory of many countries in Europe, I would say that Poland would finish around, say, in the outskirts of Moscow, as it was before in the 17th century. Austro-Hungarian Empire will take half of Balkans. France and Germany will be still at war over some parts of the territory, and so on, so on. So this, you know, the scenario we have now, it's a pure nightmare, because we are now have all the old boundaries and all the nightmares about European boundaries awaken, and it turned out that the institutional inertia of the security system in Europe is there. I mean, we thought that all those institutions with thousands of people, thousands of troops involved, it really works. And the institutional engagement with Russia, it might help her to find her way, and find not only her way to develop, but also her place, a new place in Europe. What we see now is that Russia would like to come back not to the Soviet Union. They would like to go farther to the, let's say, 19th century status, but please try to imagine Europe in the 19th century. And they should be aware of the fact that it's impossible to go back to the realities of Europe of the 19th century. They cannot once again convincing all the people that Ukraine should not exist, Poland should not exist, Baltic countries should not exist. This kind of, you know, illusion, or I don't know how can put it in a language of psychiatry, but it's really totally irrelevant. And if you take a look at the history and the statehood of all the countries in Europe, I would say that what we achieved with the support of the United States in Europe for the last 30 years, it was really a comfortable situation when all the conflicts, all the disputes, they really were, let's say, put onto into the libraries, on the shelves, and nobody discuss any longer the borders or the security problems in Europe. It was really something for the generation which went through different, you know, the military conflicts, and not speaking about the 1989 developments. If we take a look at the security system in Europe, we can now say, okay, so what went wrong? Why those relations between West and Russia, Central Eastern Europe and Russia, they were totally wrong. I mean, in a wrong way, means Russia's second thoughts were totally different we thought that all those institutions are enough for Russia to fill the kind of leadership in the Eastern Europe. And I'm not speaking certainly about the Baltic countries or Poland, because we belong to the central or northern part of Europe, and it always was. But Russia's formula of engagement, I would say, maybe was to some extent directed into something which deepen isolation, or the feeling of isolation of Russia, and as it was also mentioned by Richard, that was kind of the say the feeling of losing the face by Russians and the national pride, and the national pride is the part of Russian national legend, and I can add to my curriculum vitae that I spent also 5 years in Moscow, and I can tell you that probably it's one of the roots of the conflict and the situation when Russia nowadays is still trying to go back to not 50 years ago, but 100 or 150 years ago to find its previous place. It's like, you know, copying the example of Chinese strategy when they are saying that they had, let's say, 150 years of bad times, and now China would reach the previous level of the end of the 18th century, when China, together with India, both of them were the biggest economies in the world. And by mid of the century, China will once again, in the history of humankind, will be the biggest economy and one of two political leaders. So I follow the reactions of the politicians and scientists from the countries I used to work and live. And I can tell you that it was a really very, very mixed reaction for those developments in Europe. But I let's say, put it in a nutshell, it was a kind of misunderstanding and confusion. What really is going on? Why Europe used to promote itself as a role model for security system for other regions? Nowadays, it turned out that the security system is fragmented or even collapsed, and we have to start to build it a new security system. And we love to compare ourselves to Indo-Pacific, when the security system is very fragmented, and now it started to being built once again, and to other regions. But nowadays, once again, is déjà vu for Europe, but we are on the verge of something which might turn to the not only regional conflict, but the global conflict. And let's say what happened in the first half of the 20th century now is repeating itself in a new form, in a new modern form. And for us here in Central Europe is a big question also about the change of leadership in Russia. Because if you take a deeper look, and this is the last, let's say, last sentence in my intervention. So if you take a deeper look into the history of changing leadership in Russia, there is always a big negative impact on other countries in Europe when the change of leadership was too fast, or let's say was turning into the big, not international, but domestic conflict. Thank you very much once again. And I'm now certainly waiting for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. It was also very useful. Despite, I have other suggestions, but well, we have to propose our ideas and to debate them, and to find solution for our planet, because I think now it's our role as thinkers really to take the initiative and to advance and to be in the front lines and not to leave politicians to work alone, because politicians need to calm down a little bit, because we need to avoid Third World War, because all of us are highly convinced if there is a Third World War, launched nuclear weapon will be used definitely. That means real destruction for the humanity. Well, it's my turn now to talk about the future of the international security. And when we say international security, it doesn't mean only the military security, but we have humanitarian needs which represent security, sometimes more urgent than military shelters or protection of military usage. For example, when we have lack of nutrition security, and we have starvations, and we have people, we can lose millions of people lives, and we can witness millions of people dying because of starvation, because of this war and because of this crisis. And well, we have also the energy security, as James started. Mr. Biden just took a decision to ban all petroleum and gas coming from Russia to enter the United States. So that's pushing, in my opinion, the Russian President Putin to escalate more. Not only to escalate more, but the gas and petroleum to get increased accordingly. And he cannot sell his products, especially with the SWIFT banning and the banking banning. In my opinion, that will escalate the Russian side more, and decision makers of Moscow will be escalated against the West, which can push them to take unwise decision to use the nuclear weapon. And this is the point we must, all of us, in my opinion, cooperate to avoid this moment. We are in front of fait accompli for the moment that Putin invaded Ukraine, and we need to treat the situation, and we need to, in my opinion, calm down the situation, not to escalate it, because the elements who are in war now or involved in this crisis, all of them are nuclear powers. We are not in front of Iran of 18s and the army of Iraq of 18s. They will keep fighting each other, and the situation is still limited militarily there. No, we must be aware we are in 2022. 95% of states are involved in this crisis are nuclear powers. And when we are talking about nuclear powers, that means there is no one far of. United States will not be far of missiles of Putin. Russia will not be far of missiles of American or Europeans. So we are in front of really dramatic scenario if we continue escalating the situation and not finding a root and radical solution for the problem. Putin thinks he has fears of the intervention of NATO on his borders, on the Russian borders, I mean, through Ukraine, while Europeans and Americans saying Ukraine is a sovereign country. Okay, we can find compromise between the two. sides, we can still find a solution to make both parties happy and both parties to be satisfied, the Ukrainian side and the Russian side to calm down. Because again, on the international security level, the humanity will be seriously threatened and will be in real danger if we continue escalating this problem. The nutrition and energy security, which will be completely damaged, in my opinion, especially in big parts of the world, in the African parts and in Asian parts. And when we say African and Asian parts, we must be more strategic than thinking it will happen far away. No, it will not happen far away. It will happen also indirectly in Europe. How? By the immigration, by waves of immigrations Africa will send to Europe once there is starvation, or once there is huge collapse in Africa. We will witness millions of immigrations again, and we will face again the dilemma of 2015, which we faced here in Europe. And that's threatening Europe more than the nuclear, because these waves, unorganized, I'm not talking about the immigration, I'm talking about the unorganized massive immigration. This is destructive because they come and they overload everything in the society which is not ready, like the health regime, like the employment regime, economic regime, housing regime, everything. They overload it while the societies are not ready. So that's really dangerous, and we must keep that in mind. We are no longer isolated or can isolate ourselves of the problem, because we are the main elements of the problem. I mean, Europe and United States. So I was just talking before we go to this meeting, me and James and me, we were talking about idea of launching also a global forum on international global forum on peace and security, international peace and international security, to be equivalent of Davos Forum. It will be here in Sweden, and to be a yearly meeting for decision makers to come from around the world in the nice Swedish atmosphere and peaceful atmosphere. You know, Sweden, last war Sweden entered in was 1814. It's a very peaceful country. So leaders will be happy to come here, especially in summer, to discuss how to keep peace and to create from this global forum, like following up committees all along the year for the conflict areas and for sensitive areas, because now we will go out from this Ukrainian-Russia crisis. We will enter directly in China-Taiwan crisis with the United States confrontation, which may happen anytime, according to Mr. Henry Kissinger's expectations. It will happen certainly before 2024, but can happen any time, any hour. So we need really now to push forward to calm down the politicians in order to avoid the nuclear point, which we will reach it certainly if issues just to continue like that. Well, I finished my intervention, and I will let now questions. I got two questions, but written. Do you prefer me to say the questions, or you prefer the participants themselves to go ahead directly? How do you prefer?
I don't care.
Well, Richard, you have a question. Should the U.S. relocate some of its forces from U.S. Indo-PACOM to the U.S.-EU COM? Should U.S. relocate?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't really think this is feasible in American politics. I mean, you have to realize that losing in 2020, Donald Trump got 75 million votes. And so there's not consensual public support in the United States for rebuilding the American military presence in Europe. Not consensual support in the United States for loyalty to NATO. Maybe this war has profoundly changed the way Republican congressmen and senators are going to work. I'd be pretty surprised if it would really bring about that kind of change. But you know, if you want to prevent events like this, the problem, Mahmoud, with everything you said, couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. Right? Security is not a one-dimensional issue. But the problem is that on the military dimension of security, if somebody wants to disrupt it, he can do it, as we've seen. And, you know, Putin only wants to because there's this widespread feeling in Russia that, as Putin keeps saying, Russia was robbed. I personally think that, you know, the New York Times this morning had all these congressmen, Democratic congressmen and Republicans, talking about we have to increase the military budget. You know, I think Les Aspin was an extreme critic of military budgets, and I am too. That's why I went to work for the guy. The American military spending is largely wasted. But how do you control what the Russians have done? You know, when I personally think because of nuclear weapons that Putin won't cross a NATO border, but there's no guarantee. The only thing to do is to rebuild. Professor Lukaszuk was talking about fragmented security system in Europe. That's put in a nutshell what took me 15 minutes to explain.
If I may weigh in, since I am a former member of Congress, I agree completely with what Richard has said. I'm hoping that this may be a moment when both Democrats and Republicans alike grow up a bit in the Congress. That's a lot to hope for. There was a report came out just a few years ago by a bipartisan commission selected by the Congress. One of the co-chairs was a man I greatly admire, who just happens to have been my college roommate, Ambassador Eric Edelman. It studied the defense budget and our defense stance outside of the internal studies that are conducted by the Department of Defense. And this study pointed out two important things. First, we need to increase the defense budget. It was at that time around 4%. They would have preferred increasing it to 6%. They settled on a recommendation of 5%. Well, it's down to about 3% now, and maybe less. And they also said that we need to spend it in a lot of different ways. And they focused on, of course, the fact that so much of our military equipment is aging, and so much of our force levels have been declining. But also we need to think about the new ways in which conventional wars may be conducted. And here, of course, we're seeing already that in addition to the shooting war aspect of this, there's also the economic war waged by countries that don't want to go into combat. In this case, I think that's for a lot of good reasons. I agree with the Biden administration, despite the pleas of the heroic president of Ukraine, that we should not adopt a no-fly zone in Ukraine, because that might end up having Americans shooting Russians and vice versa, and goodbye Poland if that happens in terms of a rapid escalation, not to mention a lot of the rest of the world. So we have to be careful about that. But Richard's right. In the Congress, you have this sentiment that is a combination of isolationism from the world and some peculiar detest for much of the rest of the world. Trump didn't create this; he fed upon it. And then on the left wing in the United States, we've always had a problem in the Democratic Party with people who don't understand that in order to be able to focus our interests on improving social programs and the economic well-being of American citizens, we have to have a secure national defense. And furthermore, that we have to be willing to defend our friends in the world, because we're at risk if they are. And that wing of the Democratic Party has grown over the past generation. And somehow there must be some kind of coalition built that takes a look at the world in a new way. Now, I think President Biden will support that approach. Like any president, he comes into office wanting to do one thing and finds out that he has to spend his time doing something else. Well, he wanted to be a domestic president. He's now going to be a foreign policy president, at least for the foreseeable future, and he needs to be. So far, I think he's largely stepped up to that challenge, and so is Europe, in my view. I think the Congress needs to, as Lincoln said, to think and act anew. If furthermore, on something that both Richard and Thomas said that I think is so true, I recall the story of when a little boy who was interested in growing up and being in politics asked President Truman, "What should I do in order to learn how I should act when I'm in politics?" And Truman replied to him, "Read history." One of my worries now is that too few people who are in positions of making decisions publicly for the United States and Europe actually read any history. And especially in the United States, we're people with a short attention span, and we've always been like that. We're people that are future oriented. We've always been like that. We've never been people to study the past all that much. We fight about it, especially nowadays, but it's largely on both sides from a position of shortfalling in education. But we need to understand these irredentist mentalities that are driving what the Russians are trying to do. And of course, I utterly oppose their way of thinking, but as both of you have pointed out, we need to understand why they're thinking what they're thinking. It doesn't have a thing to do with communism. It has everything to do with the czarist regimes of 150, 200 years ago, and they're thinking that not only is Ukraine part of Russia, but so are the Baltics, and so is Poland, along with a few other places. Well, that's just not the case. And as much as some Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine may have lamented their separation from Russia, or some Russians may lament their separation from Ukraine, we have to go no farther than the nearest television or smartphone to see evidence that the Ukrainians think they are Ukrainians. They don't think they're Russians. And they don't want Russians telling them what to do. They remember what Russia has done to them. They remember Stalin starving millions of them in the 1930s. They remember the Soviets coming back and oppressing them and suppressing them, dominating them in the aftermath of World War II. Even though the Ukrainians had fought side by side with the Soviets against Hitler. And now they have to sit there and listen to Putin say that, well, they're a bunch of Nazis. And they just don't want to be part of Russia.
James, you have like 1 minute, 30 seconds.
I just finished.
Because we have lots of questions.
I just finished.
Waiting. You are done? Okay, great. Well, Thomas, Mr. Ambassador, you have a question. How should the stance of India vis-a-vis the conflict be evaluated? This is for you, Thomas. Mr. Ambassador.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mahmoud. Yes, so India's position, I would say that India's Russia for India was all-weather partner, and for India, the situation nowadays with Ukraine and all the sanctions is not comfortable at all. We have to remember that the defense industry of India is extremely dependent on Russia's technology, not speaking about the space program of India, which actually is not, I would say, not dependent, but it's fully Russian. And if introducing all those sanctions, we have to remember about the interests of countries like India. But at the same time, we can also think about India as the country which could help us to put back the agreement with Iran on place, and we could have a supporter. Maybe is a very strange alliance when United States, India, and Iran, they are uniting themselves against Russia with those countries. But I would say it's also the very important matter of the energy security for India, and I know that it will be like the tightrope for Indian politicians and balancing between Washington and Moscow all the time, keeping in mind that economically they have to think about both United States and Russia at the same time. What is also important in the context of India is that the very good relations of India might be also useful to maybe counting down what we are discussing now, the conflict. And I would like to emphasize once more that probably Washington DC would prefer to have weakened and sometimes unpredictable one country instead of having 30 countries in the territory of Russia and having 30 new partners to speak and to debate on the, let's say, the peaceful coexistence, the provisions of the UN Charter and the security system, both Europe and Asia. So once again, I'm really thinking warmly about let's say the negotiations of President Biden or President Kamala Harris, with President Putin or somebody representing Russia to find a new place for Russia. Maybe the experiment with democracy, which lasted in Russia too short, because it was altogether in the history of Russia, it was no more than, let's say, 5 to 10 years. I hope that the model Russia could find for itself, it will be very useful for United States, for Poland, and for India. We have to find really the formula which make Russia predictable and important partner for all of us in all areas, not only politics, but also economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Well, left two questions. It's one to James and one to me, I think. Yeah. The one to James, and after I answer the last question, we will end the meeting, or at least we will end the live broadcasting, and we can sit to talk a little bit. The question to James is how Biden's Made in America executive order could impact the world economy.
I'm sorry, repeat how bargains made.
How the executive order which Biden issued under the name Made in America, how can that impact the world economy?
Well, the United States, of course, until China catches up, remains the largest world economy. We'll see what happens there. I think the United States will continue to be one of the most prosperous world economies because we're not communist. But anything that is done of this nature by the United States is going to have a broader impact on the rest of the world. And I think that's certainly true in something like the energy marketplace, which is, we've mentioned earlier, is global. It's very nature. Oil and natural gas are commodities. So it's all a matter of just price. I think there are many nuances to that in terms of different qualities of oil, but still it's a commodity. And here I'd like to say that this is amount of some. This is something that Biden was compelled to do, that he may not have wanted to do. But Mahmoud, he was not reluctant to do it because of any concern that leveling more economic sanctions against Putin's regime might be the wrong thing to do. He was concerned about the domestic political consequences for him. Americans don't like high gasoline prices, even though historically our prices have been much lower than those in much of the rest of the world. We just want to be able to fill that gas tank, burn those fossil fuels, and head down the highway. And it's been harder for a lot of people to do that, especially working people, middle-class people, because it's gotten so expensive to fill the tank, even before this happened. And now this is sort of adding insult to injury in terms of higher gas prices. And Biden's political advisors have no doubt been telling him not to do this because he's just rebounded for the first time in the polls after a long time. And they're worried that he could tumble down again heading into the midterm elections where Democratic prospects are, shall we say, less than good.
Talking about elections, James, there is another question asked for you. Can this conflict have an impact on the upcoming midterm elections? And
Well,
also the same question for you, Richard, please, if you can answer also. Richard, after
first of all, I think the cards are stacked against the Democrats. And for those who don't know it, I am a Democrat. Democrats have very narrow margins in the House, and yeah, we've got a split Senate where we can't even seem to get the Democrats together. Ordinarily, in the first by-election for your international audience, after a presidential election, the incumbent president loses a lot of seats. So that's the tradition, that's the trend. And this year, I think for a combination of reasons, among them the fact that Democrats have just not been able to get their act together domestically, not to mention the pandemic and everything else, Democrats could well do even worse than historically. So that's where we are in terms of that already. And in the near term, in the past week or two, Biden's poll standings have gone up considerably because I think the rightful impression that he's doing a pretty good job on this issue after bungling Afghanistan so badly. But in the end, unless this war seems to directly threaten Americans, then I think it's the Americans' perceptions of what is happening to them in our economy, not what's actually happening. We had a huge growth in jobs last month, but their perceptions will determine the outcome of the election. And basic things like the price of bread and the price of gas at the pump are very key in pivoting these elections.
Thank you very much, James. Richard, would you answer the same question? Please?
Sure. I'm generally in agreement that the Democrats are in trouble. How much in trouble they are is constrained by the fact that there are now very few competitive seats in either house because of gerrymandering by both parties. And so the Democrats' margin in both houses is very narrow. So I expect both houses will probably change hands when a few seats move to the Republicans. The war has clearly helped Biden because it's muted Republican criticism of him and forced them to scramble with the fact that in the past they've been relatively positive toward Putin, who's everybody's villain now.
Some of them still are, Richard.
Some still are. And that's great. But see, this war is a wonderful thing from Mitch McConnell's point of view, because it makes the loudest Trump voices fall silent. Even Trump himself has condemned Putin as, having engaged in the Holocaust. So that kind of helps marginalize Trump and the Trump supporters. But it doesn't help the Democrats much. For one thing, this war is not going to go on until November. Right? Either the Ukrainians are going to lose or the Russians are going to give up. One thing I didn't talk about is, Secretary Austin said, I think very wisely, I kind of like that guy. The Secretary of Defense said, we don't have boots on the ground in Ukraine and we just don't know what's going on. But nevertheless, we hear about sort of massive demoralization, unwillingness to fight. There's a rumor that 5,000 of these contract soldiers refused to enter Ukraine, arguing that their contracts don't provide for it. So it's quite possible. I wrote about this for the CIA in a report that's been published. Even the Soviet army had grave problems with commitment. Those grave problems with commitment to combat is what kept them out of Poland in 1980. And I wrote about that too. So it's a very corrupt society. people steal the soldiers' food. The reason the gas shortages have showed up, fuel shortages have showed up for this Russian invasion, is that the officers steal the fuel and sell it onto the market to make money for themselves. So, you know, maybe the Russians run out of steam. If they do, then we're back to the American politics of inflation and the ability of the Democratic Party to keep Joe Biden's campaign promises. And then the Democrats are in big trouble.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And we will take the last question. This question is addressed to me. And after that, we will stop the live streaming. Then we can sit a few minutes together to talk a little bit. We did not talk among us. Well, the last question is how, let me read the question exactly. What are the panel of solution to be proposed to end this conflict? What type of steps must be taken by both sides? Well, I think I answered part of this question in my earlier intervention. We need to have, firstly, some wisdom in the international community, because the international community now is losing the wisdom, and it's somehow normal in the international community to lose the wisdom time to time with escalating of powers. When powers get inflated financially, economically, militarily, etc., societies and decision makers get inflated too. Decision makers get inflated, and when they get inflated, they lose wisdom. So they need to become wisdom again. In general, the most wisdom moments over the history comes after conflicts, but unfortunately they come on the destructions, on destroyed nations. So in order to avoid destruction nations now, we need to plant and to escalate the wisdom. The two sides, East and West today, they need a will to eliminate this conflict reasons. So they need to find a compromise, because the war will not solve this crisis radically. We must understand the war, either part will win today. The second part will keep trying to trouble the winner part. So we will have instability. And the winner part today will be unstable. If Russians win this war, it will be a second Afghanistan for them, simply. And today we have 20,000 fighters, foreigner fighters, already arrived Kiev and other cities of Ukraine. So it will be another Afghanistan. Russians need to understand that. They need to give up a little bit their dreams. And meanwhile, the West also need to understand it's not the best idea is to confront Russia all along the term. It's not the time of Cold War anymore. It's not the time of 14th or 15th or 16th anymore. It's time really. The world is approaching other steps, because the world has nuclear today. That means the smallest event can lead to explosion of end of the human race on this globe, simply. So, and this crisis, if it's eliminated, in my opinion, even with a compromise with Russians, Putin will not be the winner as the West to be winner, because the West wants today to be unified in order to confront the Russian challenge on Taiwan. So we need really to get rid of this crisis by a compromise, not by a fight. We need to keep the energy to the real battle, which will happen definitely on Taiwan. And when the West lose Taiwan, will lose its length, simply. Its length, its arms, simply. That means Russia will have access to everywhere to Japan, to South Korea too, and also to the will be stronger in the Middle East because it already exists in the Middle East since a while today economically. Also in Africa. So in my opinion, we need to compromise the situation with Russian side to find a compromise to end the solution, and that feasible. In my opinion, the requests of Putin can be satisfied, and the requests of the West can be satisfied as well. Well, because Russians, they do not need to be a member of NATO, but they need prosperity. This is their main target. So a membership in the European Union can guarantee for them prosperity, while getting rid of the request of being member of NATO can assure the Russian decision makers, and on this base we can find a solution, and radical solution, long-term solution for the crisis, which can be more dangerous and be very dramatic on all the humanity, not only on Russia and Europe. I think I answered the question, the last question. Now I will stop the streaming, except if anyone wants to say anything to be broadcasted, because this broadcasting will...
I just wanted to thank everyone for watching.
Oh, you're very nice, you're very kind. Well, thank you. This record will stay on our YouTube channel and also be podcasted on the website of the EIIR.eu.